Welcome to Three Thoughts On. Today, we continue our series on longevity, and my guest today is Martin O'Day. Martin, how are you doing today?
Wonderful. Never better.
Thank you, Martin, for making the time. I know you have a pretty busy travel schedule, so I'm grateful that you're making time to be here with us today. Before we get started and dive into the topic of longevity, can you take a couple of minutes and tell us and tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what were some of the things that led you on a path to be doing what you're doing today?
Okay, yeah, thanks for inviting me, Rafael. It's nice to talk to you. I guess I curiosity brought me to this field about 15 years ago. When it was very small, it was just really the scientists that were interested in the biology of aging at that time. And I met Aubrey de Grey in 2010 in London. And I guess his conceptualization of this whole the paradigm that we had and should have really struck a chord with me. So for many years, he spoke about metabolism, damage, and disease, and seeing those things as a continuum, and not splitting the idea of aging and disease as being two separate things, but the disease being the end point of the aging process within specific organs, um, and therefore damage repair being the intelligent way of addressing diseases as well as aging. That really struck a chord with me a long time ago, and it always felt like it would permeate society at some point. And to be honest with you, it feels like 2023, 2024 is that point. So yeah, I'm just fortunate that I happened across it back then. It was a small community, and I got to know a lot of the main players quite well. Um, and so I went on. I did little bits of advocacy and hung around the community and went to conferences over the years, and then kind of led my own conference. Excuse me. Around 2018, 2019, I tried building this out, and then 2020, excuse me, we were ready to go in 2020, and the COVID regulations came in. So, 2022, we launched the Longevity Summit Dublin. Um, I'm fortunate to work with Aubrey again on his foundation, and I'm also currently working a lot towards creating a longevity club, um, where we leverage, I guess, those connections I built up over the years with literally the leading, dozen or 20 people in the field, but leverage a substantial portion of that to bringing basically the very top end of what's possible to members of the club, we'll say, at the moment and going forward. So yeah, I don't know if that's a reasonable summary.
No, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. Let's dive into this because you mentioned a couple of things, and there's a few buzzwords that people use today when they talk about this particular topic. And you haven't been in it, like you mentioned. You were in there 15 years ago when it wasn't mainstream,
Hmm.
when a few people were only the ones talking about it, and those that were talking about it were knee deep into the science part of it and not necessarily the marketing part of it. So if you
Hmm.
fast forward to today, everybody's talking about it.
Hmm.
And that is very good, but it also brings a lot of confusion to the everyday person, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's very important to separate the science and the foundations of longevity, aging, lifespan, health span from the marketing that tends to get to people fairly quickly. So, in your experience, if you look back at 15 years ago when you first got exposed to this and you started working with these scientists, and then you fast forward till today, what would you say are some of the, let's just pick three because this is a Three Thoughts On podcast, biggest misconceptions about the space that you're working in right now?
Jesus, that's a tough question. So I think a lot of it comes down to the idea that um, lifestyle interventions and longevity are the same thing. Um,
Mm.
Everything is connected to longevity. Everything we've done, from childhood immunization to better control of heart disease and so on, of course, that extends average lifespan and health span. And yes, your diet, your lifestyle, all of that is super important, um, and will allow you to extend the healthy period of your life and your life itself to a degree. Um, but I think that being kind of mistakenly equated with biology of aging research is a big problem. And these things should be complementary, but not one recognized as meaning the other, which it is not. Like, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but if you live a perfect life in whatever kind of environmental lifestyle type setup that we create, I don't know for sure, and I'm not sure anyone knows for sure what the benefits of that are, and they are substantial, but they have a limit. We don't see people who live frugal, really healthy lives pushing out lifespan, and we do see them pushing out health span for sure. And it's interesting to see. Look, I guess nobody has lived the way we're living currently. We forget when we say, "Oh, where is the 130-year-old?" We forget how long it takes to get to 130. I think sometimes, and we forget that anyone that's aged 90 or 100 now was born in the 1920s. And what access did they have to different behaviors and lifestyles for the first 50 years of their life? So it's difficult to know how much we can gain from current lifestyle interventions, but it is certainly limited. Um, and what's the attempt to look at the biology of aging is a different field. It's complementary, but it's not the same thing. So it's the idea of looking at damage as it accumulates and repairing that damage through medical interventions. And there's a variety of proposed interventions. There are some that we're already doing or on the cusp of doing. Um, and I think one of the best answers to this question, people ask, again, not to be over talking about one individual, people do ask Aubrey repeatedly, what would you do for your longevity? And he says, I would invest money in aging research. I think that's a really good answer. I'm not suggesting for a second that you shouldn't live healthily. And if we look at this as a ramp that we're trying to exit, then absolutely you're buying yourself substantial time for coming interventions if you live very healthily. Sorry, that's only one misconception, and I've talked about it for a long time. But
That's okay. That's okay.
I think it's really central at the moment because everyone has, like, there's an awful lot of people. There's people that are very authoritative with YouTube channels that speak as if they are. I was trying to use an analogy for this recently. It's like they're in the foothills of a mountain, and they are explaining to everybody what the mountain looks like. But there are people that have been almost to the top of this mountain or have climbed a lot of it 25 years ago, and the others are arriving on the scene and pretending like they don't exist, kind of thing. But yeah, it's great that longevity is so topical. It's wonderful. It's amazing, and a spotlight is being shone on it. But I think the spotlight needs redirection a little bit from just lifestyle intervention.
And I think that that is interesting. The idea that lifestyle intervention is limited to me is actually relatively new,
Hmm.
because for a number of years, I think I was on the bandwagon that that was the holy grail. If I do all these wonderful things, and you hear about blue zones, etc., you do all these different things,
Yeah.
you read all these different things, and you think that, uh, well, that's it. And now we're finding out, at least I am finding out now, because this is new to me, that there's also the other side of that coin, which is what you're saying, is that the biology of identification of damage, and then the repair of that damage, and then the prevention of that damage. I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Attia, Dr. Peter Attia. He just wrote a book on longevity, and I was listening to a podcast, him talking with Sam Harris, and I love your thoughts on this. But he said something that in my mind was, again, this is all very new to me. I'm certainly not an expert, but I'm very curious about it. He said something along the lines that, at least in his research, he found out that if people did certain things, like what happens in these blue zones, right, where people tend to live more active lives for a bit longer, that to his surprise, people end up dying of the exact same things as everybody else is dying of. They still get cancer, they still get heart disease, they still get all the various things that we get. They just get there later in life, and they end up having more years of adequate activity. Right. So instead of dying at 80 of a heart disease, they end up dying at 102, but they still die of the same thing. Right. And I think, in my mind at least, I love you to correct me if I'm wrong. In my mind, that basically attests to what you just said. Is one thing is lifestyle intervention and leading to lifespan, but then what about the disease? And what about the prevention and identification of that disease process? Am I in the right ballpark here?
Absolutely. And again, I'm not an expert as well. So this is just kind of absorption of information and listening to conversations for all those years. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And like I said, these really shouldn't be an either or type conversation. I mean, of course, you would like at the current stage, it's still true that the best thing you can do is lifestyle, because lifestyle is a very substantial gain. It's 10% or so for health, and I'm sorry, lifestyle for lifespan and healthspan is a 10% gain, we think, which is enormous, like just enormous. But there may be, a number of percent gain from like a proper administered senolytic in a couple of years' time. And let's just imagine that's a 5% gain. That would be an extraordinary boost on top of that. And I'm not suggesting that that would be the case, but just an illustrative thing. The lifestyle, I guess, has a limit in that the business of being alive kills you eventually. Metabolism is beyond our control. It's just too complicated. It's just too many things going on to manage. We can slow down the damage somewhat, but yeah, like we don't see with all the ways that people have lived over the centuries. And I know most of those are, in times where you're exposed to a lot of things you're not exposed to now. But even still, with all the monastic lifestyles or all these different things that have been tried, we really don't see people living even, you know, outlying health spans, never mind lifespans. So I think there is that it shouldn't be a negative story. It really shouldn't. These are like things that should complement each other. You do the best you can in terms of your metabolism and in terms of lifestyle and stress and all of those things, and you get yourself that additional 10 years perhaps, or whatever the number is. Maybe it's less than that. It depends. If you're going to have a heart attack in your 40s, then it can be 40, 50 years that it's added to you to have a particular lifestyle, right?
Hmm.
But on average, it looks like it's 10 years or less. Um, but that's enormous. That's a huge thing. But the point of the matter is that when we talk about damage repair, then I think maybe people balk at that a little bit and balk at the idea that you could repair the damage entirely. And so you could
Hmm.
retain the youthful risk of death every single year. Um, but I would add one other thing into that, though. When we look at the specific diseases, we are all in support of alleviating or eliminating those. So if it's cardiovascular disease, if it's a cancer, if it's a neurodegenerative disease, nobody will say, I don't think you should try to fix that. Okay. But what we're really discussing here is that damage is like the mother disease, and all of these are children. You know what I mean? They're just organ based systems that deteriorate to a point where we call them a disease. But that deterioration has been happening at a cellular and molecular level for a long time. Now, if someone walked into a conference and said, I have a way to prevent heart disease, nobody has a problem with that. If they walked in and said, I have a way to prevent Alzheimer's, no one has a problem with that either. But if they walk in and say, I have a way to prevent all of those diseases, people start to have difficulties, which is just, again, I think, a point of psychology more than biology, and is something people can get. They can repeat exposures. It's such a shift in how we understand our relationship to the world that it's not surprising that our minds go into defense mode and look for problems and reasons why this isn't true. It's like a natural reaction. But repeat exposures and thought normally lead people, or nearly always lead people, to embrace this. And I think that's what I hope happens more than anything else. That the fact that people are on this longevity bandwagon now, which is amazing, if they just see it as a lifestyle intervention based bandwagon, then I think that's a missed opportunity. I think we need to have people explore the science a little bit more thoroughly and appreciate what people have been doing for since the 90s. Really, this has been an active field. Neuroscience has been an active field of research. Very small, very, very poorly funded, and still is. The basic research is shockingly poorly funded because it is like going upstream of diseases that we spend a fortune on, you know, and we wait for the disease to happen and then try to reverse it.
Hmm.
There's so many analogies you could use. Like, I know a town that I lived nearby when I was a kid was flooded year after year after year, and you put sandbags on the floor or on the doors of businesses and everything, and the flood would come. They moved back up river a few miles, and they widened the riverbed. That's the end of the flooding. So it almost feels like it's that type of idea. That rather than firefight, rather than we should at least spend some of our collective resources on the biology of aging, and that's the best way, or it's certainly a very valid way to target preventatively these diseases. And the benefits for society and for healthcare costs are just astronomical, even if it's partially successful.
That's very interesting. You mentioned something that I have personally been struggling with as I try to convey my message, right? I've been experimenting with myself for a
Mm.
number of years now to try to have a better quality of life, to try to engage in practices that at least are well documented, that allow me to feel
Yeah.
better, that allow me to sleep better, and to perform better physically, more movement. And what I find is this, you mentioned the psychology of this. I find this resistance to good because of what's considered normal. And it's considered normal to just age, slow down, ache, become limited, and then fizzle away, right? So there, on one hand, there's this expectation that this is just what it is. This is what life is. Once you're past 50, it's all downhill. Okay.
Yeah.
It's all not great. And when you start saying, well, no, that's not true. Look, if you stop eating these things, if you start doing these things, if you start moving in this particular way, if you start taking some of these supplements, if you start eating these types of foods, if you start meditating, if you start doing all these various things that are tied to, body, mind, and spirit, you can change your life.
Yes,
And
and invest in aging research as well. I'm just
of
like
course,
I'm trying to add to it. Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I think the psychology of it is fascinating. So, like, there's plenty of studies, including the Blue Zone, where they see that really it's the socialization component of it seems to be the most visible common denominator to these blue zones. that they have a sense of purpose, they're included, they're not put in a nursing home and left to die, and all the kind of sedentary nature of life that comes with that. They walk on hills. They have, like I say, community roles. And there's another study. I don't know exactly what the study is called, but it's this really widespread longitudinal study where they looked at asking people at, I think, like 60 or 65 how long they expected to live. And the people who expected to live longer, which sounds ridiculous until you think about, well, that reflects their optimism, their outlook in life, their psychological kind of baseline. And it clearly has an effect on how you function, how you move, and how you stay fit and agile and all these other things throughout your life. So I think that all of that stuff is amazing. I just think that it needs to be added to very substantially, because there are people, we have agreement in longevity science, roughly speaking, to what goes wrong, in categories called the hallmarks of aging. These are the types of damage that accumulate. We've had agreement for 20 years as to how you would intervene on those types of damage. So not only do we know, okay, I need to be careful how I speak here, because there are plenty of very serious people who will argue that there's no unknowns, and sure, fine, but generally there's an agreement that this is the main body of the type of damage, and these are the interventions that will be required to halt or indeed reverse in some cases those types of damage. And there's so much need for or room for optimism as well, Rafael. Like, the body has repair mechanisms already, and some would argue that what happens is the repair mechanisms get into disrepair. So rather than having to repair the whole system, you repair the repair mechanisms, and that helps an awful lot of things. So there's reasons for real optimism on biology of aging research leading to interventions that will really slow down the accumulation of this damage and the entrance of diseases. And when you're talking about living well and living healthily, I guess that's always going to be desirable for psychological benefits. But at the moment, I think that's really desirable for giving us more time to avail of coming interventions, which with AI and with more money and everything else really seem to be speeding up every day.